Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining the Hudson Valley Regional Council today. We are going to get started on our second webinar in the CARES Resilient Economy Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today, we will be focusing on retaining small businesses after a crisis. My name is Carla Castillo, and I serve as HVRC's Interim Executive Director. I'm joined by Lynn Knight, Certified Economic Developer, and Calandra Cruikshank, founder and CEO of Statebook International. And I'm assuming we're on the next slide, Caleb. Oh. Thank you. The Hudson Valley Regional Council is an organization of county governments established in 1977, comprising Dutchess, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Sullivan, Ulster, and Westchester counties. It is one of 9 regional councils in the state and one of approximately 650 regional and planning and development boards in the country that, in addition to providing a regional perspective, offer education and outreach, technical assistance, and advocacy to the communities they serve. HVRC delivers these services to its member counties as well as local governments, and by extension, the over 2.3 million people who call the Mid-Hudson home through several federal and state grant programs. The focus of the grant programs are listed on this bullet point on this slide, and we work closely with the U.S. Department of Commerce, Economic Development Administration, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation on water quality and climate smart work, the NYSERDA Clean Energy Communities Program, and also listed as HVRC's Climate Action Planning Institutes that we developed. HVRC also provides regional platforms to our counties through the Materials Management Working Group and to regional sustainability partners through the Mid-Hudson Regional Sustainability Coalition. Next slide, please. Our contributions to the region could not be accomplished without our many regional and state partners, some of which are shown here. Next slide. Today's second webinar is a part of a 3-part series of HVRC's larger CARES project. The CARES project will present the impact of COVID-19 on the Mid-Hudson region's economy, as well as the region's learnings and best practice responses. The project will also outline national best practices to the pandemic, as well as provide best practice options for responding with resilience to future impacts on our economy. This work is funded by the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act through the Economic Development Administration. HVRC is grateful to our member counties and largest population centers for their participation in the project and for the invaluable information shared. We ask that you post comments and questions in the chat throughout the presentation. They will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Small businesses are the backbone of the economy, of our economy. In fact, in the Hudson Valley, 70.7% of all business establishments employ 9 persons or less. And yet they often get left behind to fend for themselves when there's a crisis. Our illustrious speakers today, Lynn Knight and Calandra Cruikshank, will discuss why it is so important to pay attention to business retention, to understand who is the most vulnerable, and ways to ensure small business survival is part of your economic recovery. They will discuss specific steps that can be taken, as well as creative financing and technical assistance to help businesses get back on their feet. In addition to Lynn's work as a certified economic developer and manager of economic recovery of an economic recovery program, Lynn also served for 5 years as vice president of knowledge management for the International Economic Development Council. Lynn was also executive vice president for the Institute of Sustainable Development and has served on the Economic Development Board of Advisors for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Lynn is the author or editor of more than 50 publications, most recently including States of Resilience, a study of state-level resilience initiative, Leadership in Times of Crisis Toolkit, and the Changing Energy Landscape and its Impact on Economic Development in America. Calandra is founder and CEO of Statebook International, the first online location intelligence platform democratizing data to transform how people, companies, and communities thrive. Statebook provides efficiency to both corporate site selection and economic development, providing a unique, holistic view of all industries. Calandra has served as Director of Operations for Good Deed Foundation, where she grew its constituent marketing program from its inception, managing the recruitment and engagement of hundreds of nonprofit organizations representing more than 80 million members nationwide to proactively support products and services carrying the Good Deed logo. Calandra began her career as a journalist, working as a political reporter for the Legislative Gazette in Albany, New York, and later as a business reporter for the Daily Camera in Boulder, Colorado. Thank you, Lynn and Calandra, for joining us today. Next slide, and over to you, Lynn.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having us today. And thank you for coming out this close to the holiday. You know, this topic is one that's a favorite of mine. And I would say if you have time and energy and resources to do nothing else, do this. Because after a crisis, businesses do really need the help. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about why getting help to small businesses is so critical. And, you know, I'll be talking about small businesses primarily. Sometimes large businesses need help as well, but we do know that they have a lot more resources. So we're going to focus on the ones that are the most vulnerable. We've boiled it down to 5 ways that you can help businesses after a crisis. It's by no means just limited to 5. But these are 5 major topics that I hope you consider, and hope you look at these regionally, because when you see them, you'll see that, you know, not every community will have that resources to do every single one of them. But if you operate as a region, most likely you will find the resources. And then really, what's the role of community leaders in all of this? Next slide, please. So, you know, one thing we know, after a disaster, businesses typically have to fend for themselves. Everybody is looking out for housing, health and safety, repairing damage to infrastructure, but help for businesses is typically pretty scarce. A best case is if they all have insurance and that they have some cash flow, money saved up, and a business continuity plan, you know, for if the worst should happen. In the case of small businesses, you'll see most do not. But, you know, at the end of the day, getting people back to work and money flowing into your economy is just as important as any other major activity, like, you know, restoring housing after a disaster. Next slide, please. So typically small businesses are not prepared. We know this. I mean, 60% don't have any kind of an emergency plan. You know, they're very busy just getting open, and business owners, small businesses owners tend to be stretched thin and very focused on, you know, getting their products and services out to their customers. But if they don't have a plan, as many as 43% won't reopen at all after a crisis. 75% will fail within the first 3 years. And honestly, as an economic developer, this is extremely frightening. It's too much of an economy that you've worked very hard to lose. And so that's, you know, again, why we want to see what we can do to help small businesses. Next slide. So who's most vulnerable? Here's the list, and this came from a national study that was done by the Federal Reserve Bank. Obviously, businesses that are new have only been in operation for a shorter period of time. Minority and women-owned businesses are very vulnerable. Why women-owned? Well, you know, whenever there's a crisis, it seems like there's a shortage of childcare. Women are more impacted because they're traditionally the ones that take care of children. Businesses that lease versus own their location. This is a very big factor. If you are a tenant in a building that needs to be renovated after some kind of disaster, you couldn't be kicked out. If you own that building, you're much likely to be able to control the schedule and what you're going to invest in to repair. Tourism is a very fragile industry. So those that are in tourism or retail tend to have big impacts. Wholesale businesses, it's an interesting question. Depends on what kind of wholesale you're in. If you're wholesaling building materials after a disaster, you may actually have a boost. If you're wholesaling soft drinks, you may not. So it depends on what kind of wholesale. Manufacturing businesses are often impacted by disrupted supply chains, or if there's a disruption in their workforce. And then there are those that rely only on the local market. So if you are, really dependent on your location for traffic and a lot of walk-in traffic, if you are only focused on a certain type of resident that's in a certain area and that area is damaged, you're gonna be hard hit. Those that are located where other businesses don't reopen. So we've seen this happen where, if you're in a shopping mall and the anchor closes or businesses around you are dark, it's very hard for you to attract people to your location. Distressed downtowns, for example, people don't want to go to a distressed downtown where there's lots of dark buildings. Those that are in highly competitive industries sometimes don't fare as well, and especially those who can't adjust to changing situations. So, we saw this a lot after COVID. Those businesses that were really stuck and rigid in their business plans tended to have a harder time than those that pivoted, got online, reached out to new markets, tried new things. Next slide, please. In terms of the cause of damage or losses, notwithstanding COVID, because COVID affected everybody all over the country. But if it's a natural disaster of some kind, here's the type of disasters that are going to hurt businesses the most. 65% loss of power. I was thinking about this yesterday when there was this attack on the power system in North Carolina. Everybody, of course, wants their power back on, but the business damage of that is really quite substantial. If you're a restaurant, you could lose your inventory of food, fresh food. If you can't get onto your computer, you might be missing messages from customers, etc. So power is the biggie. Flood can damage so many ways. Equipment, insides of offices and buildings that get, mold afterwards, etc. Wind damage from a hurricane or from a tornado is another biggie. Debris, even if your business wasn't damaged, just having a big pile of debris on the road in front of your business can really hurt you. It's very hard on morale and customer traffic and your ability to rebuild if you've got debris everywhere. Other is a big category: lost customers, delayed shipments, and then fires is just 1%. Next slide, please. So for this presentation, to help it be easier to digest and remember, we've boiled it down to 5 ways you can help businesses after a crisis. And again, I want to say there's more than 5, but these areas are places where you can make a big difference by doing certain activities and making certain things available. And these are also 5 things that you should work on together as a region rather than trying to do all yourself. Next slide. First thing, let them back in. So if you had any kind of business damage in natural disaster or COVID or anything, the last thing you want to do is keep business owners and managers and employees out of their business for a long period of time. Here's some examples. Oftentimes, emergency management will come in, they'll block off an entire area and completely close it for safety reasons. But if floodwaters have come in and there's no way for businesses to get in there and clean them out, pretty soon, what do you have? You've got soaked equipment, you've got soaked records, you've got soaked inventory, and you've got mold. And this gets very unhealthy. And the initial damage is one thing, but then the secondary damage from the water not being taken care of can be even worse. And what we saw in the Florida Keys, for example, some businesses didn't even want to leave despite the evacuation orders. They faced being unsafe rather than being locked out of their businesses for long periods of time, because they know that it might take them 10 days or more to get back in, and they're going to be dealing with an awful lot more damage than if they were there slogging it out during the disaster. Now, this is not a good thing. I talked with some employees of a restaurant, for example, in Big Pine Key, that stuck it out, and they were literally fighting for their lives, swimming through the restaurant, thinking that they might save some things rather than evacuating. Very, very difficult situation. In Colorado, in 2013, they had a bunch of really serious forest fires in the Colorado Springs area. And then in August, they had rain. So the rain came quickly down the mountain, down through the burn scars, and flooded lots of small towns. And some of the small towns were not allowing anybody back in for 6 weeks. So you can imagine if you're a restaurant that caters to tourists and your restaurant was full of inventory, they lost tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of inventory. Next slide. There is a better way. So a business reentry system is something you can design in advance of any kind of disaster. And I think it might be a good thing, Carla, if you guys advocated for this. It allows for a safe, orderly return of the right people to the right facilities. And this is important because you don't want to allow looters in. So the way it works is you pre-authorize ID cards or passes for individuals and businesses who register as being authorized to get back into that business. And then local law enforcement gets trained to recognize the pass. And you can do it based on a tiered system. So not everybody is let back in, but people who, are, owners, people who the owners designate, like managers, and you might have certain businesses that are essential to get back in and others might be let in at a little bit later tier. Next slide. So Louisiana really pioneered this. They have a website where you can just see everything right there. I've given the link here, and they encourage businesses statewide to go in there and create a credential and print it out. And it's low tech, but it's something that you can post in your car windshield so that when you're trying to get into an area, you're already pre-approved. And they have used this system multiple times. Next slide. Number 2. Well, this seems kind of silly, but we've certainly seen all kinds of misinformation after a crisis. Do you know which businesses were impacted? A lot of times community leaders do not. And I was sharing with Carla recently that, I've been doing some work in Kentucky with disasters there. And we did a lot of interviews afterwards to try to find out what the impact was. First first thing you'll start to see is media stories, and you can pretty much imagine that anything that's being published in the newspapers has been checked out. And so you'll find some businesses mentioned. But then when you start to talk to community leaders and you say, okay, you know, X number of people, how many businesses were actually hurt in your county? We've heard answers anywhere from 0 to everyone. And, you know, for those that are trying to help businesses recover after the fact, you really need to try to identify exactly who was impacted. So what I've seen also is that sometimes community leaders don't think of everybody as a business, even though they are. So, oh yeah, there's a family farm down the street. Well, that's a business. The local restaurant is a business. Yeah, they usually recognize that. The medical center, the dentist office is a business. So the answers you get to this question, if you're interviewing people to try to find out the answer, will be all over the map. In one case, you know, we were told, oh, not too many businesses were hit. Well, then come to find out as we're driving around, there were really a lot. And they needed a lot more help than local officials thought. There's also the issue of secondary impact. So, you know, maybe this business that sells hay and feed was impacted, but then the farmers down the road that rely on that hay and feed are also impacted. The truck drivers that drive it around, the boats on the river that ship it up the river. I mean, you know, there's all up and down, there's secondary impact. Next slide. We developed this in Kentucky. I was feeling concerned that we couldn't get accurate lists of the businesses that were impacted. So I started doing some research about what GIS maps were available. So the illustrate on the left is the state of Kentucky. They have this map program that's put out by Zoom Prospector, which is based in San Francisco, and you can hire this service from them using Forrester data. They have the locations of all licensed businesses. And the cool thing about it is you can select your community, you can select a city, a county, you can select an industry. They have businesses by NAICS code, so you can select all businesses or just a certain kind. So you can filter it. And then I also found that NOAA, our National Weather Service, had the tornado tracks on another map. Excuse me. So we created a layer of the tornado track. So as you can see, the yellow is the strongest winds, and then there are feeder bands going out with lesser winds. And all of these points on the map in different colors are businesses. And so we can zoom in, we can see the locations by address, and we can see what types of businesses there were. You can click on any one of these dots and we get contact information, website information. And this really helped us to be able to see which communities were directly hit, how many businesses were affected, et cetera. And this happens to be the city of Mayfield, which suffered a very direct hit, as you can see, right through the downtown. Next slide. So from that map, this is just a small piece of it. From that map, we were able to extract into Excel a list of 1,147 businesses that were impacted by those tornadoes on December 10th of last year. They represented 9,771 employees. And as you can see, we can pinpoint their exact address, the city, how many people they employed, their estimated sales, and then further along in the spreadsheet are their contacts, phone number, NAICS code. So we could tell, oh, you know, this number of small businesses were directly hit. So this is a very, very useful list that we use to do outreach to these businesses. If it's a tornado, this is, I think, very easy because NOAA will always have a map. If it's a flood, it's a little more complicated. What we're finding now in the Kentucky floods is, getting a hold of the actual flood locations is a little more difficult. But pretty much for any type of disaster, whether it's a fire or a flood or a tornado or a snowstorm, even you could do this, and this will give you a definitive list of businesses. I'm going to turn it over to Calandra for the next slide. You've got a couple slides of a different type of analysis called the Mobility Monitor.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Hi, everybody. I'm Calandra Cruikshank, founder and CEO of Statebook International. And these screenshots here are of a project that we did with Hudson Valley Regional Council using mobility data from cell phones to identify different hotspots in the community, specifically different points of interest and businesses that were impacted by COVID-19 in terms of how many people in the region were actually visiting them. Was that increasing or decreasing after COVID, we're still during sort of, but after COVID and from before COVID, and what those impacts were. And so you can use the exact same insights to identify changes in foot traffic or frequency of visits or length of time that people are spending at your businesses, if they're visiting different businesses. So, during COVID, we saw a lot using the mobility data from cell phones. We saw a lot of people not shopping at the grocery store or ordering online and just going to the grocery store and picking up, as opposed to going to the grocery store and shopping. We saw a lot of the Main Street traffic decline dramatically during the early months of COVID because of all of the lockdowns. And so we were able to identify, especially looking at the fact that small businesses, which are the topic of this discussion, about a third of them across the country were dramatically impacted by COVID and didn't reopen. So being able to analyze this data literally in real time and over time and identify the trends in your business community, and particularly the small businesses, which, as Lynn has pointed out, are very often overlooked, or it's difficult to get this kind of analysis from traditional, methods like surveys and things like that. Instead, we can use technology to literally in real time track what the impacts on your small businesses are. I know it's a little hard to see because this is a small version of this, just to kind of cram a lot of data into one slide. But on the left, you'll see some of the businesses identified in Poughkeepsie, and the little gray boxes are just calling out which specific businesses or points of interest that is. And then the same information is on the right without the points of interest being named, but just showing by the different colors and over time what different areas are, or hotspots or points of interest are not, or the foot traffic was increasing and decreasing. And we measure this both by foot traffic and also by dwell time. So the dwell time is how long somebody is spending in a particular area. And that can also track and map things like, commute patterns and origin and destination. So we can track, from a specific period of time, in this case, 2019, pre-COVID, what were people's general patterns once they left their house? Did they go to work? Did they go to the grocery store? Where did they go from there? Et cetera, and then look at how that differs after COVID. So here in these two screenshots, you'll see the top one is looking at 2019 to 2020, and then the bottom one is looking at 2020 to 2021. So it's a pretty good indication. You can see how the the colors have really changed and what the differences are. Next, one before it will go back for 1 sec. Thank you, Caleb. One thing I just wanted to point out is that if the population density is there, this can get as granular as a 50 by 50 square meter grid. So this can get very, very local in your community and really identify specific points of interest and the general trends across an area. Okay, Caleb. This is looking at that same data and the dwell times for specific points of interest. I just included a few here that we were just looking at on the map. So like the diner, the city hall, restaurants, the bank. How much time were people spending between 2019 and 2021 during the analysis? Was it up to 15 minutes, which would be a big indication if you were looking at like the grocery store. Pre-COVID, you might have been spending, 1 to 3 hours in the grocery store, right, to go do a full shop versus during COVID, during lockdown, maybe you're just ordering online and you see a 15-minute blip as somebody goes to just pick up their groceries that are, essentially at the store ready for them to go so that they didn't have to go inside. So these are the kinds of things that we can observe. And obviously things like, town hall meetings and things like that shut down during COVID. So that was a big dramatic decrease in the number of people visiting there and so forth. Go ahead, Caleb. This is a really interesting view of this data. So on the left, you'll see what looks like sort of city buildings. It's actually population density. So we're measuring where the hotspots are that people are actually congregating in, and this can be very real time. And then on the right, you'll see there are a lot of blues and then yellows. This was looking again at specifically Poughkeepsie. And so all of the blue dots on the top slide, top picture there from 2019 to 2020, you can see the blue dots are where there has been a decrease in traffic coming to Poughkeepsie from those locations. And you can see the oranges and reds are showing this is where people are coming from. During 2020, all of the traffic to Poughkeepsie was very, very local. And then in looking at 2020 to 2021 in the bottom visual there, you'll see those reds and yellows are now spread across the state. And you can see basically people are starting to come back to Poughkeepsie from all over the state. And the amount of very local traffic was less as it relates to the amount of traffic that had picked up coming to Poughkeepsie from around the state again. Next slide. So Caleb, is there a play button for this? Can you hit play?
I'm not.
Just click on the graphic and just see if it does play.
It does not. Maybe if I go out of full screen.
Yeah, maybe. Does it play then? There was a play button, but I didn't know if it would translate in the deck when I sent it to you, especially if it's a PDF as opposed to a. So it doesn't matter. Basically, this is that same kind of visual showing the density of population. And when we are able to hit play, this shows literally hour over hour, day over day, how people are moving around the city. So you can see that heavy line kind of going north-south across, in this case, Fort Lauderdale. That's the major commute route. And that cluster of what looks like buildings in the bottom right in dark red, that's actually density of population. So you're looking at where most people in the city go to work every day. So it's really an interesting view, and during a disaster can help you understand, like during COVID, a view like this of the people, how people move around your city can be incredibly helpful, because you can see the majority of those cross streets running east-west across town are not heavily populated. Not a lot of traffic is going through those. So those would be streets that would be really easy to close off. If there was a disaster, you would know, okay, these are not our corollary commuting patterns and so forth, traffic patterns, so we don't have to worry about those so much. And we really need to pay attention to that heavy artery. Also, same thing in a disaster, like the kinds of maps that Lynn was just describing. Where are your small businesses? You can see where most people are coming to work every day and or shopping and so forth. And we can identify using the dwell times what activities are actually happening in those locations. And we then know where to focus our attention during a disaster, because you're able to identify historically what people's, movement patterns are and where they're shopping and where they're not, and what the impact of a disaster is. Thank you. Next slide, Caleb. Back to you, Lynn.
So a third way to determine what's going on with your businesses after any kind of a crisis is a business assessment. And interestingly here, the federal government, federal agencies cannot do this for you because of the Paperwork Reduction Act. So it must be a local or regional activity. It can be done by chambers of commerce, by organizations like HVRC, economic developers, mayors, anybody could do it. It's a very helpful way to find out who and how they were impacted. So just a couple of examples here. After the tornadoes in Western Kentucky, the Mayfield Chamber of Commerce, which is that map I showed you, they surveyed their members. And they got all kinds of responses, and they found specific examples of businesses needing help. One that I was able to help with, there was a woman who had a chicken farm, and she said she lost all of her chickens. And she said, I know there's not going to be any help for me, but what can I do? Well, actually, there's exactly a program that I was able to connect her with USDA, where they do livestock replacement. So that kind of survey, there was a direct example of a business that could be immediately helped. The one caution is, if an organization is going to do the survey, they should be aware of what programs can help. So they may need to have some additional backup from federal agencies or any others that can look at the results, but can't actually do the survey. After Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Michael, I organized volunteers who did door-to-door surveys in small towns and business districts. In Hawaii, after the volcanic eruption in 2018, we also surveyed businesses, and some of these graphics are from that. Caleb, can you open up the screen to the results of the Hawaii survey? I wanted to show everybody what it looked like. You might need to, yeah, that's a good impact. So you can kind of scroll through this slowly, and you can see, so we were able to determine what kind of businesses they were in. We had a lot of responses from tourism and agriculture. A lot of them were longstanding businesses. 56% had been there 10 years or more. However, over a third of the businesses were closed, and a third were open but not at full capacity. So this was really concerning. And then we had businesses that stayed open, and they talked about why they were closed, what they were experiencing here. So like the biggest section of the pie, those were businesses that stayed open, but their customers and markets declined, 32%. That's very huge. And 18% were closed permanently. The revenue decreased. 3/4 of the businesses had a decrease in revenue, and 54% had a decrease in customers. We also found that 63 businesses were considering relocating somewhere else on the island, and 44% were considering leaving the island. This is really, or 44 businesses were considering leaving the island. This is terrible. And then this was a qualitative question about, what were their biggest challenges? Well, the Black 70 some businesses said they were having trouble with the government, they didn't agree, or they were having difficulty communicating. So these are all the various reasons that they were impacted. We asked questions about what infrastructure affected them, and this gave us clues as to what we should focus on. Access to internet was extremely important. 36 businesses said that access to power was a major concern. And then we asked questions about how this impacted their employees. We saw that, a lot of employees were impacted. And the loss of revenue was the major reason because they couldn't afford their employees. I think we're just about at the end of that. Are there more?
That was the last page.
Okay, yeah, 30% decrease in employees. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. So I would say conducting a business assessment, if you should ever need to do it, I'm happy to share the survey. We have a basic frame of a survey and it can be customized to any community. And if there's some special questions that you want to ask related to anything that you're focused on, such as workforce, you can always adjust the survey. We did it as a combination. Online, of course, is very easy and it's easy for us to tally, but we also found that some businesses needed to have paper copies because they didn't have access to their computers. This was a big deal for us in the Florida Keys when so many businesses lost everything and they didn't have either online access or even a computer. We had some that, we passed paper surveys around to the different chambers of commerce meetings and even made them available at our hotels. And then we had grad students help us type all the data into the database so we could prepare their results. Next slide. Calandra, this is yours. Your slide.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Lynn. So this is actually looking at Statebook data and just pointing out, there's one piece of this missing, but it might be to the far right, or maybe it fell off the slide. But it's pointing out that the majority of businesses, and Carla was alluding to this at the beginning of the presentation, the majority of businesses in your community tend to be your small businesses, your businesses that employ 1 to 4 or 5 to 9 people. 10 to 19 is the next category. The piece that was missing showed that for businesses that employ 1,000 or more people, which very often are the ones that are the focus of economic development organizations, there were only 9 total in the entire area here that we're looking at. And so when you think about those 9 businesses that are technically your largest employers on an individual basis versus all of the small businesses collectively, they actually are the largest employers in your region and need to be paid attention to, because as Lynn was pointing out, that's a dramatic piece of your total GDP. So it's really important to understand who those small businesses are, what sectors they're in, and how that potential loss in GDP after a disaster will impact your community as a whole. So this data is really critical. And I think after COVID was one of the largest surprises to economic developers who tend to, again, kind of have the most focus on their technically their largest employers, not realizing that it is those small businesses that don't get in the press all the time and don't have a ribbon cutting for their business necessarily, that are actually the largest employer across any region. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, we have already looked at the results of this, so we can move on to the next slide. So the fourth thing I would say to pay attention to is technical assistance. So what is technical assistance? Here's some examples. This is where you do some hand-holding. This is where you do some case management. Some businesses might need to completely rewrite their plan, and most businesses need financial management help. Some might need marketing. Maybe, they used to be just an actual physical business, and now they're going to become more virtual, and they haven't worked with websites before. That's an area where you can provide assistance. business continuity training. There are programs that teach businesses about the importance of insurance, how to protect their data, how to keep track of their customers and employees, and how to put together a crisis plan. That's what goes into business continuity training. So you could be a host of such training. Workforce retention strategies and policy rewrites are something that may be important both to businesses and to the community. So for example, a policy rewrite might be something that gives employees more leeway to work remotely, and many businesses were facing this after COVID or during COVID, like even when I worked at IEDC, we were not allowed to work remotely. After COVID, they had to write the employee policy to allow it. Some employees may need some retraining support. Maybe there's some of their activities are different after a crisis. We were just, I was recently talking with the state parks in Kentucky, where they now have a lot of survivors being housed. And the employees of the parks are used to dealing with tourists and recreational visitors just during the daytime, but now 24/7 they're providing care for families. So they need some training in how to handle certain issues. Commercialization and tech transfer programs can help. Maybe even market analysis. Their market has changed after COVID and other disasters, and do businesses know how to address it? So you can provide technical assistance in that area. Next slide. SBDCs are a valuable resource. These are funded by SBA. I'm sorry, I've got Kentucky there, but there is a SBDC New York. I looked up, in your area, you actually do have quite a few small business development centers, and these are usually housed at community colleges, sometimes at universities. So you've got one in Rockland, you've got one in White Plains, and both of those also have satellite offices. The Mahopatnam outreach area and Fordham University, and then there are quite a few in the city as well in New York City. But these organizations, for free or very little money, give business coaching. They might do things like help small businesses prepare financial packages for financing, conduct market research, and provide connections to other small business resources. When I had a small business years ago, I was a recipient of some of this kind of business coaching. I was trying to sell my business and I needed help preparing cash flow statements and just generally checking over my finances and making sure that I had everything packaged right for investors to sell the business. And it was really helpful. They provided about $2,500 worth of accounting services for free to help me as a woman-owned small business. Next slide. Okay, this is a big area, financing. And I suggest you think of it as creative financing, because there, as you'll see, there's quite a few things that can be done that are, maybe out of the realm of what you know right now. One of the things we do know is small business owners will do just about anything to remain independent and avoid more debt. They may borrow from their credit card, take out second mortgages, max out their cards. They'll borrow from family and friends. We've even seen instances where they'll borrow from their kids' college fund. All of these are pretty disruptive ways to get money, but they're in a hurry and they know that if they don't get some financial help, they may not be able to afford their employees. But the truth is, if they could get some good financial help at a low interest rate, it could turn things around completely. So let's go through some examples. Next slide. So typically they don't need that much money. Most need less than $25,000 to get by. And there are all different kinds of financing. So Small business administration loans always come in after a major disaster. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about bridge loans. Emergency microloans, these are for really small businesses, less than $5,000. A forgivable loan, which is the type of loan where you don't have to pay it back if you do something that is agreed upon in advance. And then grants, small grants to businesses. Next slide. So here's a program I think is really good. Obviously, Florida is in the way of hurricanes, and the state has a $30 million bridge loan program that's available to be activated at any time. And it's basically a very quick turnaround. Within 4 days, you could get a loan up to $50,000 with no financing. I mean, you basically pay no interest for the first 6 months. And they make it available for a short period of time, knowing that businesses may need to find some other ways to get money, but they need something quickly. So they make this available, and it's typically 6 months. They can extend it if the state decides, but then they start to pay interest. And it should eventually be replaced with something else. I think this is a very proactive program. This is done on the state level in Florida, but it could be done on a local level. So for example, if Carla, not committing you to this big thing, but if within the HVRC area, you wanted to create a bridge loan program in the event you had another flood like you've had over the past 10 or so years, you could create your own bridge loan program through a local CDFI. Next slide. SBA typically comes in, they have 2 types of loans really. So the first one is for property damage, and that's available to both businesses and residents for homes. And these are for those that were directly hit. And they usually come in and they try to encourage everybody to apply. And, some don't want to, some can't qualify, but this is a very low interest loan. The next one usually has a longer term lead time, and that may be available for 6 to 9 months after a disaster. And this is for those that had economic injury. So, loss of customers over time, or supply chain problems, or for one reason or another, the business needs working capital because as a result of the disaster, they had longer term losses. And you don't have to show that you had physical property damage. Next slide. So this is just a grid version of that. The first 2 rows are about businesses, and actually no, the last row is also about businesses that can get money for mitigation. These are all through SBA, and the interest rates are as low as 2.8. I mean, can you imagine? In this time, that is not even the rate of inflation. And this can be a 30-year loan. So it's a very, very good option. Even though businesses say they don't want to take on more debt, I mean, this just makes all the sense in the world if it can save your business. These deadlines don't apply. This was for a particular disaster, but typically they'll set the date. So for example, the disaster that this corresponded to was in December. So the first deadline was 3 months later in March. And then for the economic injury, it was 9 months later. So this is typically how SBA sets it up. And it's a pretty substantial amount of money that's available. Next slide. Microloans are typically available through CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, not directly from SBA. but SBA provides the money through the local lending institution. And they usually package this with technical assistance so that the recipients have a better chance of being able to make really good use of the money. Next slide. New York State has a revolving loan fund. So $500 to $25,000 for small businesses and others up to 20 million. So this is, you know, to help businesses that might not normally be able to get commercial loans. So this is definitely worth looking into and being knowledgeable about. Next slide. Just the other day, I was delighted to see this. Through a new grant to the Hudson Valley Agribusiness Development Corporation, there is now a new revolving loan fund for anybody involved in agriculture. And so this is available for several counties in your region: Ulster, Dutchess, Columbia, Greene, Orange, and Sullivan counties. This was just announced on, I think, Monday. So brand new. Next slide. By the way, those couple of examples I gave in your area may not be all there is. I'm sure there might be more. The point I'd like to make here is that, you know, as community leaders and economic developers, being knowledgeable of all of the various things that are available will make you a great resource to help businesses in a crisis. You know, these organizations will do marketing on their own, but I'm suggesting to you as economic developers, combining all of these programs into something that you can hand out, you know, either a brochure or refer people, or having a list available. If you're knowledgeable about them, you're going to be able to help your businesses. So a forgivable loan, I've seen these less seldomly, but these are oftentimes in extreme circumstances, you know, where, you know, we know that businesses are going to have a hard time. And if they stay open and if they keep their employees, they're basically given an incentive. And that incentive is the rest of their loan will be forgiven, or maybe the interest will be forgiven. There's a lot of different ways to do this. It's typically given to businesses that already have a track record of good repayment for other types of loans. Next slide. Emergency small business grants. So this is like the icing on the cake. You know, typically government can't just give money to businesses. This type of small business grants are more likely to come from a local government or from a CDFI. Somebody funded it. Excuse me. A gift from a foundation. Or you can even set up a local grant, and we'll go through a couple of examples here. Next slide. So here's an example. Bastrop County in Texas is a very disaster-prone place. They've had thousands of acres burned. They've also had floods, and they've had tornadoes. So their Chamber of Commerce worked with the United Way initially, and then they set up a 501c3 to raise money that could be used to help small business. And they gave out grants eventually to small businesses. Next step. Next slide. Calandra, I'll let you talk about this example.
Sure. So in collaboration with the International Sustainable Resilience Center, or ISRC, my company Statebook founded a product that we call the Resilience Scorecard. You can take a look at it at resilienceScorecard.org. And it provides, as part of the scorecard, it provides a whole regional toolkit for disaster recovery of all different types and strategies to build resilience in economic resilience, specifically in your communities. And these are just a handful of different points that are made in the resilience scorecard, which is basically a self-assessment that your community can take, and then a step-by-step framework of a whole slew of different types of tangible steps that your community can implement to build economic resilience for your businesses, both to report back to your local stakeholders, and also it's helpful in reporting to EDA what you're doing to be able to improve resilience across your community, given EDA's new focus on resilience, economic resilience, and then also to report back to businesses that might be considering your location, or like Lynn said, considering leaving your location because they're not getting the support from government or other infrastructure that is required for them to establish and have confidence in the region's ability to ensure business continuity in the face of all different kinds of disasters, from natural disasters to pandemics to cyber risk to terror risk. There are so many different factors that can impact businesses these days. And so these are just a couple of the resources that this tool provides in terms of things that you can do to help improve economic resilience across your community and help you show businesses how you can address the fact that, you know, they're going to face these risks no matter where they locate, right? These days, it's just inevitable. And so what businesses really need to understand is what steps is your region putting in place to be able to ensure business continuity and the ability to respond and recover from any kind of disaster. And so the resilience scorecard has a whole toolkit in it that shows resources from FEMA, that shows different steps that you can take, like establishing a business emergency business recovery center. There is funding from state departments of emergency management and from FEMA to cover implementing this, building your economic risk profile. This goes along with a lot of the points that Lynn has made in this presentation, being able to identify and both in identification of your businesses and also the frequency of different types of disasters and past impacts, and being able to really understand what that is in your region and how you need to prepare. And then developing funding mechanisms to incentivize businesses to encourage their development of continuity plans. Lynn was mentioning this as well. And there are organizations that have funding and models to help provide resources to do this. And then things like organizing resources to protect and quickly restore essential services such as power, water, telecommunications. Lynn also mentioned that. So these are just a handful of examples of these types of tangible steps that you can take.
Okay, on the next slide, I want to just talk a little bit about, you know, these are some examples of communities taking matters into their own hands locally. So these, you know, across the country, what we saw is communities had all this COVID money that was coming in, and in some cases they gave it to businesses in an organized way. So, for example, down below the graphic, all these logos here: LISC LA, ISD, Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, LAEDC. Gosh, I can hardly read different cities. City of Los Angeles, County of Los Angeles. They got together and they took some of their COVID money and they created a grant program, which was an online application. Businesses had a certain period of time to apply, and through sort of a lottery system, they could get grants to help get through COVID. Arlington, Virginia had a couple of $1 million that they wanted to give out to small businesses. So we prepared for them an online application and scoring system. And in their case, they wanted to make sure that they helped the most underserved businesses. So they gave extra points for women and minority and veteran-owned businesses. They also gave points for resilience. So businesses that they could see were exhibiting good practices that would help them pivot and remain in business for long term got extra points, as well as those that had been in the community a long time or those that had multiple locations, et cetera. In Westchester County, we took that same system and that same questionnaire and rebuilt it for Westchester. And I was so excited to see the way they implemented it. Again, they wanted to do it based on a merit system rather than just a lottery. And so we created a scoring system that their IT department programmed for each of the questions. So the minute an application was submitted, it created a score. So it was very easy for us to then say, you know, who the winners were, and we were able to sort them by the different communities within Westchester, the different industries, et cetera. So there was some human input into how they were awarded, but it did give us that score. Westchester has done several rounds of this now. They did one that was just for nonprofits, and I think they've done 3 or 4 rounds overall. So it's a great way to give some of the money back directly to the business. Next slide. There's yet another way to help is to help organize business to business in-kind assistance. And, you know, as an economic development organization, to help large businesses who want to help smaller businesses by donating products and services, I think this is a really great in-kind kind of thing that helps both businesses. They did this in Moore, Oklahoma after their really devastating tornado. And, you know, they had all kinds of donations like furniture, office space, equipment, and services. So it was a very good part of the overall relief effort. Next slide. So, you know, what can you do? Obviously, there's a lot of ideas here. You know, so first of all, I'd say encourage businesses to get technical assistance. So for you to know where that assistance is available, it's always available through the SBDC, but there might be some other organizations as well. You can persuade banks and investors to create funds and different kinds of loan products. So we've given quite a few examples here. You can also create a grant fund via donations to give businesses in a real emergency situation. So there's lots of different things you can do. Even if you don't put any money of yours into it, you can gather the information and be ready to push the information out, and that will be extremely helpful and help put you in a leadership position. I think that's the last slide, but let's move to the next. Yes, it was. So now we're really happy to have time for questions if anybody has any. And definitely, you know, if you just want to make a comment or talk about your own experience, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Lynn and Calandra. I think I would like to, yes, open it up for discussion or for any comments on the content that's been shared. Any thoughts before I share some of my thoughts?
Hi, Lynn. Josh Mitchell. Just a quick question for you. So in your experience with the business assessment surveys, could you share a little bit about, I understand that the federal partners can't administer the survey, but how can communities get assistance for them, and what kind of assistance can the federal partners provide to the communities or organizations administering the disaster assessment surveys? And then second part of that is, what are ways in your experience that you found have been successful in incentivizing response? You know, at this time after disasters, small businesses often get survey fatigue, and without direct tie to, let's say, grants or receiving assistance, how do you incentivize them to respond? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I do want to give a shout out to Josh Mitchell. Josh has worked with me on 2 disasters now, and has just done a phenomenal job in research and pushing information out to communities. So thank you, Josh. He's based in Colorado, but works all over the country. So with the survey, I have done this in multiple places now, and I feel that we have a very good business retention survey. So we can help by giving you that survey. I would say it's in the public domain already. It was initially funded by a grant from EDA for us to do that work. And as a nonprofit, we did it. And so giving you the survey that you could then customize, and we can help refine it a bit. We've also done, put it online for communities, even though we couldn't do it ourselves, we put it online. We've also prepared like marketing messages that you can push out, press releases, website copy, email messages, how do you get that out? I'd say the biggest way a survey could fail, and I have seen one that did fail, is if there's not enough marketing. I saw one survey that they had open for 6 months and they only got 10 responses. Well, it was really hard to find, and they didn't put out any press materials at all. So the importance, to get a lot of results, you have to be willing to do the outreach. When we did it in the Florida Keys, we got hundreds of businesses to respond. So we went around, they had 5 chambers of commerce. We spoke at all the chambers. We put copies of the survey with envelopes attached so they could mail it in if they wanted to at every seat. And we also offered to take it out to businesses and interview them on their locations. So that helped us gather enough. In terms of incentivizing the response, one of the ways I've seen is to, at the end of the survey, the business is given a list of all kinds of resources. So I'd say that incentive can be information, or even some, in some cases, it can be hands-on technical assistance. Like, the woman who had the chickens, it was a really good incentive for her to try to find help and to get that help by the fact that she answered the survey. So I'd say the incentive is the result, but the incentive can also be information. We have a question in the chat from Mary. Mary, do you want to stick your question?
Sure. I was just, I was wondering about the economic resilience scorecard you mentioned, and I was curious if a municipality fills it out, does it more easily allow them to find grant funding that might be specific to their situation?
Yes. So I just responded in the chat, but happy to address it. Basically, the scorecard has 2 parts. One is a self-assessment. So it brings you through a series of 50 questions that you can respond to and get a score, which is your economic resilience score, basically. And then there's a whole step-by-step framework that says, if you want to improve your score based on your responses, here are the things that you can tangibly implement, and here's how you do it. It talks about the purpose of implementing each strategy, the partners you need to have at the table. It outlines some of the costs you can expect to implement each strategy, and then provides grant funding resources that you may be able to apply for, and then gives you a tangible example for that piece that other communities have implemented, and links so you can go look and see how they did it. So it's a pretty comprehensive scorecard, and it also can integrate the kinds of surveys, online surveys that Lynn is referring to, that you can then send out to your local businesses and so forth. We've also, just to add on to what Lynn was just discussing, we've also seen really good strategies where communities have put that survey out to local libraries or chambers of commerce, as Lynn mentioned earlier, places where people go to get resources after a disaster, and you can sometimes find your businesses there as well. So just to add on to that.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
You bet.
To piggyback on that question, Calandra, is there also local grant information in terms of state by state that gets pulled in for the different communities?
It's largely federal, but there are examples from SBA, as Lynn has pulled out, that are in the scorecard as well, and local and state emergency funds, FEMA types of resources. There's a whole plethora of different types of examples. And then having those tangible examples of what other communities, how they have implemented each step, often has in those examples are often included the resources that they used to help fund it. And a lot of the steps are things that only require your own internal staff resources as well. So it's not all really big things that you have to implement. Sometimes it's just internal processes or regional communication strategies and things like that only really require staff time and can be funded internally. And then other ones are definitely much bigger pieces that then the funding resources are included there as well.
Thank you. Any other questions before or discussion points before I have one question that's at the top of my mind? Okay, thank you. So one of the things that I that I find very interesting about this, this entire process, the presentation gives a really a great outlining of basically a toolkit of step-by-steps, what you should do, what you should focus on when a disaster hits. And one of the things that I'm wondering is typically in the work that you have been doing throughout the country, Lynn, do you see this most communities being primarily reactionary versus communities that have planned in advance and basically have a rule book, a guidebook for addressing, responding to disasters, and how do they fare, the difference between the two?
So more often than not, I've seen a shortage of these activities. And, after any kind of disaster, it's just so confusing and you want to do something, you just don't know what to do. And fortunately or unfortunately, no matter how you look at it, we have a lot of examples of what works. So what we're presenting here is what works. These things, if you can do these things, they make a difference. And a lot of times communities do nothing to help small businesses. Unfortunately, they're more focused on services to the community. But, as I said at the very beginning, getting members of community back to work and business revenues flowing is super important. Otherwise, you don't have the money to do anything if you don't have the tax dollars. And if people are out of a job, they can't afford to rebuild. So, don't accept that businesses can just fend for themselves. They really can't. The small businesses just can't. And a lot of times it's just assembling and presenting helpful information to them, giving them encouragement, asking the questions, what do they need? What is the status of their business? So all of these activities, first of all, you got to figure out who they are. Who needs the most help? I was really discouraged when we would go to, certain places and say, what was your business impact? Oh, they say, oh, we don't have any, or we don't have so much. That was one extreme. Another extreme is they'd give us a list of every business in the county and So for Eastern Kentucky, there were 20 counties impacted. I was given a list from the state of 15,000 businesses. Well, I know that 15,000 businesses were not impacted, so I can't use that list. It would be much better if you could say, okay, here's where the flood was. Here's where the businesses were. You know, it was this many hundred, and then we could go directly to them and offer assistance. So, you know, that early identification is really a part of it. A lot of communities don't know how to do it. It would seem to be simple. But especially if the landscape is really messed up, you might not even remember what was there. Or you might not know how many businesses were in that building that got destroyed. So that's a very good early thing you have to do, is identify who they were. You have to let them back in. Just keeping them out for the sake of avoiding looting is going to do more damage. Providing technical assistance. This is an area I'd say is probably gotten the least attention. You know, not every place has an SBDC, and not every SBDC has a lot of capacity. When I was working in the Florida Keys, for example, there were 400 businesses that needed loans and case management, and there was one person for the region. And you can imagine what eventually happened to her. She became burnt out. Were there other technical assistance providers? We were not aware of any. And yet that's a very, very important area of how to help, you know, because businesses are just overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with the cleanup, dealing with their employee issues, replacing their inventory, and any bit of mentoring or advice would have made a difference to quite a few of them. And then connecting them to financing. You know, they may think there's nothing available. You know, the typical business that, you know, you probably work with that every day in and day out may not know about all the various types of free financing that could be made available to them. You know, they may think only of their bank, and going and getting a commercial loan may not appeal to them. Getting a small business loan and being indebted to the federal government may not appeal to them. But if you point out, my goodness, even at the interest rates, it's not even inflation, and you can have money that's going to set you back up and have it for 30 years, you know, at this ridiculously low interest rate. You know, hey, that's a great thing. So it may be advocating for some of the financing. But yeah, all of these things are in short demand. Some of them are much harder than others. I think having a business reentry program set up in advance is a good idea. And you can do it now, and Louisiana invites anybody in the country to just take their program and make it available.
Well, thank you so much. This again has been an incredibly enlightening conversation and presentation. Caleb, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'd like to thank Lynn and Calandra again for this excellent presentation. Not only is it insightful, like I said, but also quite action oriented. And I think that you know, the most important part, as my most important takeaway, is creating making available fact sheets for the local governments and for the county governments, so that they can start to establish some of these, have these toolkits in place in their community so that they're prepared before an unpleasant event happens is really key. So thank you so much for walking us through this. And I'd also like to thank Caleb Fine for his expert management of our webinars. Please be sure to join us for the last webinar on December 14th, and please feel free to spread the word. This last webinar will focus on economic developers in crisis communications. The slide decks and recordings for all webinars will be available on HVRC's website. And next slide, please. And Please feel free also to reach out to HVRC's team for technical assistance and guidance on our regional efforts. Thank you so much for joining us today and best wishes for the holiday season.